Sound. It is one of the 5 things most precious to humans in life. Imagine you're out one day enjoying the sounds of life and suddenly it is taken away from you. Sound. One of the things we take for granted in our life, and one of the things taken from people of all ages, races, and backgrounds. One team of scientists set out to change that. One team of scientists set out to prevent one of the most sacred senses from being taken from us. Research into restoring sound began in the early 1800s when Alessandro Volta discovered the electrolytic cell. Volta proved these cells existed by sticking 2 metal rods powered by 50-volt batteries into his ears. The resulting sound was that of a boom. Interest in this field inspired a pair of scientists from Russia, Grasuni and Volokov, who found that the cochlea was the site of the sound simulation. Based off of this research, in 1939, a pair of American scientists, Stephen and Jones, created the electrophonic effect theory, which stated that the direct stimulation of the auditory nerve provided a crude sense of hearing. This began a new era, the era of human trials. Failures by French scientists in the 1950s inspired William House, an otologist from California. He set out to create an easily usable prosthesis that would help deaf people hear. House's device delivered a current through a wire to a single spot in the cochlea. After a failed surgical attempt in 1961, House didn't give up, and finally, in 1969, a successful attempt showed that the device created enabled the user to perceive environmental sounds, but speech was extremely distorted. Despite this triumph, many experts casted great skepticism on the feasibility of the device. House's device inspired Drs. Ingeborg de Sawyer and Graham Clark, who in the 1980s set out to craft a device that would enhance awareness of the surroundings and facilitate lip reading, but would also enable deaf people to comprehend speech without visual cues. Working alongside electrical engineer Erwin Hochmeyer, this team harnessed place coding by directing certain sounds to different parts of the cochlea. This selectivity targeted nerves that respond especially well to the frequencies received. One major challenge the team faced was the skepticism from the rest of the scientific community. Most scientists told the team that they couldn't do it, that the technology didn't exist, that it wasn't safe. They said there was no way to restore the sense of hearing, but this didn't stop the team, it just pushed them to try harder. Another challenge was the many safety issues. Finding a non-toxic component to make the device out of, finding electrical currents that wouldn't harm humans, and most of all, making the device small enough to fit into the inner ear. In 1991, an electrical engineer, Blake Wilson, joined the team and helped accomplish their goal. Wilson had found a new strategy for speech processing that provides time and place coding information in a more clear way. It presented a range of frequency pulses that are set at different intervals, or interleaving, which prevented electrode interruption. Wilson's continuous interleaved sampling system allowed many cochlear implant recipients to understand words and even sentences. The team at Duke had accomplished what was thought to be impossible. They found a way to restore one of the greatest gifts of life. But the challenges were far from over. A device that they said could never be done. A device that they said would never be made. A device that was created to defeat all doubts. Cochlear implants revolutionized the way people hear, and yet so many oppose this miracle device. To the deaf community, the cochlear implant is seen as a device to destroy deaf culture. When the cochlear implant was created, the rest of society viewed people who were deaf as being impaired. Many deaf people were pressured into getting a cochlear implant just to please their family, their friends, and the rest of society. To a person that has been deaf since birth, that becomes something they have learned to live with. Not being able to hear is no more odd to them than someone who is able to hear. The controversy revolves around the idea that deaf people are functioning members of society, and that people who are able to hear are trying to force the cochlear implant on them and destroy deaf culture. The whole issue was that people who could hear were completely oblivious to the deaf community and their history. Hearing people were seen as an existential threat to people that were deaf. The controversy led to riots within the deaf community. As the opposition to the device grows, a growing question was that is the cochlear implant ethically right?
Now for the deaf community, I think it's still an existential threat to their identity. It still continues to divide the deaf community. Many capital D deaf people say that they should be banned. Almost like changing Michael Jackson's skin color was an existential threat to the black community. If you could turn your child white, would you? I mean, there'd be some advantages in North American and U.S. society to not being black. And would you? And most black parents wouldn't. Well, neither would most deaf parents. But of course, most deaf children have hearing parents, so they're not the ones making the decisions.
Oftentimes, the people deciding if their child should get a cochlear implant are not deaf. There is a big tension between the wants of the deaf and the people making the choices for their children. Members of the deaf community wanted the cochlear implant banned because it was a threat to their way of life. If everyone got a cochlear implant, the rich community and history could possibly die out within 2 generations. These ethical questions became aware to the hearing community as they started to understand the plights of the deaf community. The days of the secluded deaf culture and the bigotry of the hearing community come to an end, and a new age where users of the cochlear implant can talk on their cell phones and engage in conversation without any visual cues such as lip reading or hand motions. In fact, over the past several years, many adult members of the deaf community who are strongly opposed to the cochlear implant have been quietly getting cochlear implants because they want to see if it actually works. This has created a big identity crisis within the members of the community, as some have not told their friends because they do not want to be shunned. The hostile attitude of the deaf community has died down in the last 3 decades as advances in cochlear implant technologies have been made. As of December 2012, approximately 324,000 cochlear implant surgeries have been made worldwide as deaf people have been more accepting of the cochlear implant.
Problems that are really difficult increasingly require interdisciplinary and international teams. I think the cochlear implant was actually a little ahead of the curve. I see more innovations now following that model of having teams working independently but then sharing. Certainly that's what's happening with AIDS vaccinations. You know, you've got independent teams, but then there's annual conferences that bring those teams together to try and share information and try and advance common cause. So in many ways, I think it was ahead of its time.
The development of the cochlear implant was a global effort during the time. It wasn't realized by people at just how much collaboration between the countries there was. Deafness was a global problem, and at the time, it wasn't just an effort led by American scientists. It was supported primarily by countries such as Austria, Australia, and the United States. To increase this international collaboration, the team did not patent the cochlear implant. They waved away the possibilities of billions of dollars because it allowed companies to improve the device, which has happened significantly over the years.
So at the beginning we thought, why not donate the results from all of our research sponsored by the National Institutes of Health to the public domain, and in that way, any good idea that emerged from the research would be utilized by all the companies manufacturing cochlear implants, and thereby benefit the greatest number of deaf and severely hearing impaired people. So we made a deliberate decision to donate all the results to the public domain. And that decision worked beautifully because all the companies did take up the ideas, and multiple of our inventions are used in every cochlear implant manufactured today. Now, I'm not a multi-billionaire because of the decision, but the policy did achieve its purpose.
The cochlear implant was a revolution to the world of science because it allowed previously deaf people to be able to hear. It was a device that challenged all odds and was a device that saw many challenges, but it was a device that created a realization in science that anything can be done with the right amount of work.